User authentication involves some of the most critical data that a JavaScript app will have to manage. In this lesson, we're going to implement Google OAuth via Firebase, but we're going to do it using Ngrx and the one-way data flow of Redux. I'd like to point out that this video is going to cover a lot of code very quickly, so if you're brand new to Ngrx, check out some of the links in the description for an easier introduction into Redux. The feature we're building today will check if a user signed in, and if not, they can sign in via Google and then sign out. And all this will be kept in a single data store through Ngrx. The first step is to add the necessary files to the ng module. We're going to need AngularFire 2 along with Ngrx store and effects. Then we're going to build our own user effects and user reducer. So we add everything to the import section and we're good to go. The next step is to model our user data. We're going to keep the user interface as simple as possible. It'll just have a user ID, display name, and then an optional property for loading and an optional property for error. Then we'll create a user class that uses these properties and build it by passing it a user ID and display name that we get back from Firebase. From here, we can start building our user actions. The first and probably most important action is getUser, which will determine if the user is currently authenticated in Firebase. If they are authenticated, then we'll run an authenticated action that will update the current user data on the data store. If they're not authenticated, then we'll run a not authenticated action that will just set a default guest user on the data store. Then to log in or sign up a user, we'll set up a Google login action. And we'll also give the user the ability to log out. And we'll set one more action for auth error just to handle any errors that might come up. Now, each of these actions will get its own class that implements the action interface. It will have a read-only type that corresponds to the constant above, and the constructor allows it to handle a data payload if necessary. To keep this part brief, we're just going to follow the same exact pattern for every other action. But when building a real app, it'd be a good idea to strong type the payload for each of these actions. And the final step is to export all of these types as just a single type called all so we can use it easily in other files. Now we can move on to the reducer function that will update the state after each auth event. So we import the user actions and user class, and then we set a default user that just has a null user ID and a display name of guest. In the reducer function, we pass it the state, which will just be the default user if it's not defined, along with the action that's being executed. From there, we set up a switch statement that's based on the action. When we run the getUser action, it's only going to change the loading state to true because we have to wait for the data to return from Firebase. Then when the user's authenticated, it's going to come with a user object, so we can use that user object to update the new state. To do that, we use the spread syntax in JavaScript, which is the 3 dots before each of these objects. For the not authenticated action, we basically just do the same thing, but instead of passing it the action payload, we pass it the default guest user. Then for the other actions, we follow the same pattern, just updating the current state along with any new data and toggling the loading state as it corresponds to the action. From here, we can use Ngrx effects to handle the asynchronous nature of these actions. So we import effect and actions from Ngrx, our user class, and AngularFire auth, and a whole bunch of RxJS operators that we'll see in use here when we start building the effects. The first effect we're going to build is the getUser effect, which is going to tell us whether or not the user is currently authenticated. So we use the effect decorator, and then we say getUser is an observable action. Then on the actions, we set it to the getUser action that we defined earlier. We're not actually going to send data with the getUser action, but if you wanted to map the payload down, this is how you would do it here. From there, we can call switchMap and then return the AngularFire auth state observable. Then I'm going to delay this function just for 2 seconds to show the loading spinner on the front end. And when we receive the auth data back from Firebase, we can check to see if it exists, and if it does, we'll create a new user object using that user ID and display name, and then trigger the authenticated action since we know the user is authenticated in Firebase. But if the auth data is null, then we know the user is not logged in, so we return the not authenticated action, which will update the data store with the guest user. And as a final step here, we'll add a catch operator, and the only caveat here is you have to return the value as an observable. So we'll call observable of and our auth error action. Okay, so that allows us to determine whether or not the user's logged in. Now we need another effect to log in the user through Google OAuth. So we'll start off doing the same thing, but this time we'll use the Google login action, and then we'll map that down to the payload just like we did before. The difference here is that when you log in with Firebase, it returns a promise. So what we're going to do is create a function that will return this promise, and then we'll convert that into an observable. We'll define this function as soon as we're done with this effect. But what happens is it returns the credential from Firebase, which we don't actually need. Instead, we can just call the getUser action, and that will update the data store with the current user. And again, we can catch the error here as well by setting it to an observable. Now we can define the Google login function, which is just straight from AngularFire 2. We just set the provider to Google, and then we call AngularFire auth, sign in with pop-up, and we're good. Then the last thing we need is a logout effect. This is going to look almost identical to the one we just defined. The only difference being we'll set the user to not authenticated after the sign out promise resolves. We call switch map and then map that down to an observable of the sign out promise and then map that to the user action not authenticated. Again, I apologize if that went too quick, but you can get the source code for this project on GitHub, or you can get a detailed write-up at angularfirebase.com. At this point, the only thing left to do is put everything together in a component. So here we import store and observable, and then we import our user class and user actions. Then we set a user property on the app state interface. Then we declare a user observable and inject the store in the constructor. So the first thing we need to do is determine if our user is logged in or not. We can do that during ng-on-init by dispatching the getUser action. So first we'll get the user observable from the store, and then we'll dispatch the action. This tells us if the user is logged in or not as soon as the app component's created. From there, we just need a couple of event handlers we can attach to buttons that will log in the user or log out the user. So now we can handle the entire process by simply calling store.dispatch with the corresponding action. Now we can go into the HTML and unwrap the user observable by using the async pipe and then setting it as the user template variable. Then we'll just display the username as well as the user ID. If there's no user ID, we know the user is not logged in, so we can show the Google login button. So we just call the Google login method on click. Then we'll use a conditional CSS class to show the loading spinner in the button when the user login process is taking place. For the logout button, we just do the exact opposite by only showing a button when the user is currently logged in. Now let's go try it out with the Redux DevTool plugin. We can see we first get the getUser action, and they're not authenticated, so we see the sign in with Google button. Then we go ahead and click that, and we get the Google login attempt, and then we get the getUser action again, and then we're authenticated. So now our entire Firebase auth process is a single one-way data flow that's managed by the global data store. That's it for Ngrx with Firebase auth. If this video helped you, please like and subscribe, and if you want to support the channel, consider becoming a pro subscriber at angularfirebase.com. You'll get access to one-on-one project consulting in our Slack team, as well as a free copy of the Angular Firebase Survival Guide. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.